Getting in the habit of keeping your Grasshopper definitions clean is going to be a very important part of working with Grasshopper. At the moment, we only have 4 components on the canvas, but already I can see that there's a bit of a mess going on. I have crossed wires, things aren't lined up. This is generally a bad sign. Imagine that as we go along this course, we're going to be gaining more knowledge. So we're going to be making more complex definitions. If you're not in the habit now of making things nicely aligned and keep things clean, imagine what is going to happen when you have many, many components on the canvas. Neither you nor anybody that you work with is going to be able to read that. Then you're just going to be creating spaghetti code. And that's not what we want. Let's see some things that we can do to keep the definition clean and also explicit so it's very readable. First of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these 3-point components. And as I do that, notice that I get this alignment widget. It gives me different directions that I can snap the components on the canvas and also distribute them. I'm going to press here the left arrow. Notice that they all snap to the left. Nice. I can also press these little bars and it'll distribute the components. Be careful because if you press up here, all of the points would be on top of each other and that would be very difficult to read. Thankfully, we have undo with Control Z, but there was a time in early versions of Grasshopper where undo did not exist. You would have to be moving those around again. Another element here are these crossed wires, and eventually the wires do go to the same input, but I prefer if they were a little bit easier to read. What I can do is I can move this distance, and notice that as I move it and it finds these straight connections, it sort of snaps to them. I'm going to try to snap to this second point. In general, I find that a definition is more legible when it has straight connections. I try to avoid crossed wires as much as possible. Great, we have things nicely aligned. What else can we do? For example, let's say that we wanted to give a particular name to these 3 points. I keep on calling them the first point, the second point, the third point. Let's go ahead and actually name them. What I can do is I can right click in the center of the component. Notice here that you get this title bar. Well, I can put, for example, a 1. It updates the component. And I can do that for each of them. So I can right click here and go to point 2 and eventually do the same for point 3. In this way, I can give custom names to all the different components. Let's go a step further. Can I actually, for example, differentiate what are the first 2 points from the third point? Well, I can. If I select them both, I can group them. And I can do this by either pressing Control G or I can go to Edit, Group. And if I do that, you'll notice that you get this colored area around the components that you've selected. All right, so we have a group here. If I right click on this new colored area, I get another little title bar where I can add some more information. I could say, for example, input points. This is not only limited to multiple components. Oftentimes, I might do the same thing for just a single component. For example, this third point, I could say Control G and just add a little area for that particular component. I could right click on there and say, for example, comparison point. I'll move it down just a bit. I do that quite a lot. Select a single component and group it to have another tag above it. There's some funky things you can do with the groups. For example, if you double click here, you'll notice that it becomes a metaball representation. And when I split them apart, the tags go on each of them. I've seen people use the metaball representation with some success, but I prefer the original boring bounding box. Double click here, and you get this other representation, which reminds me a lot of like 90s Flash rounded corners kind of thing. Also, not to my liking. Maybe you like it, that's fine. I'll keep it here on the bounding box. You can also change the color. Right click, you can go down here to color and change it to something else if you like. For example, white. If you like that color, you can right click and say make color default. So now next time that you make a group, for example with this last one, it'll be the color that you set as default. Finally, I want to talk about making the values that we've input to this definition more explicit. If you recall, I added by right-clicking on X the value. Right-clicked on X, input, went to set number, and put 10. And that's great, that works. But if I really want to make that explicit, I should have that value displayed somewhere out here. And well, I can do that with a panel. I'm going to go to Params, Input, Panel, and bring that to the canvas. And this yellow box actually is a very nice component. It has many different features. Number one, it can act just as a way to annotate the definition. For example, I can double click it as it's telling me to and say something like my first definition comparing some points. And I can keep that around. I can change the size of that. And that just becomes like a title block, giving some information to when I made the definition, who made it, what it does, etc. That's one use for the panel. Another use is to actually input values. So I can go to params, input, and panel. and I can double click it, and this time I can write a number. Be careful because here we're very used to pressing enter. Don't press enter, just write the number and then click somewhere else. Now I have a way to introduce the value, and it also becomes very easy for me to change the value. So I can put here, I don't know, 20, and the point goes off in X dimension, 20 units. I can use this and share it with the second point in the X, and I can, for example, copy it, Control C, Control V, and have that as the input for the Y over here. That makes the inputs very explicit. If you're sharing this with somebody, then they would know exactly what's going on in there. The last thing that the panel can do is be a way to view results. For example, let's say that I wanted to see these two results without just hovering my mouse. I could go to Params, Input, and Panel, and connect the output, and now I see that I have calculated two dimensions. So the distance between the first point and point 3, and the distance between point 2 and point 3. And I see that explicitly stated in the panel. I can right-click the panel and give that a title. I can say Distance Calculations. Now I have a very explicit definition in front of me. It's color-coded, it has labels, it has some text, some numbers, and it's pretty easy to read.